Every revolution begins with the same promise, a promise that power will finally change hands, that a corrupt elite will be overthrown, that a broken system will be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. Crowds fill the streets, kings fall, flags are burned, new leaders rise. And yet, if you zoom out far enough, something strange happens. No matter how violent the revolution, no matter how radical the slogans, no matter how different the new government looks, the same financial power quietly survives. Not on thrones, not in palaces, but in contracts, debt, and institutions that never face the mob. This is the story no revolution likes to tell, because revolutions are loud, banking power is silent, and silence is harder to overthrow. To understand why banking power survives revolutions, you first have to understand a simple truth about history. Political power changes fast. Financial power moves slowly, and slow power almost always wins. Let's start with one of the most famous revolutions in human history, France, 1789. The French Revolution is remembered as the ultimate break from the past. The monarchy collapsed. The aristocracy was dismantled. The king was executed in public. On paper, it looked like total destruction of the old order. But here's what rarely gets discussed. Before the revolution, France was drowning in debt. Decades of war, royal spending, and mismanaged finances had left the French state completely dependent on private lenders. The crown didn't just rule France, it owed France. And when the monarchy fell, that debt didn't disappear. It transferred. The revolutionaries inherited the same financial obligations, the same creditors, and the same dependency on borrowing to function. They executed the king, but they still needed money to run the state. So they did what every revolutionary government eventually does. They borrowed, they printed, they inflated. The famous assignats, revolutionary paper money backed by seized church land, were supposed to liberate France from financial control. Instead, they collapsed in value. And when they collapsed, the people suffered, while those closest to financial systems adapted, hedged, and survived. The revolution destroyed political titles. It did not destroy financial leverage. Now let's move to England, a country that went through not one but multiple revolutions. The English Civil War in the 1600s was brutal. A king was overthrown. A republic was declared. Then the monarchy was restored. Chaos, ideology, bloodshed. But something crucial happened in the aftermath. In 1694, the Bank of England was founded, not by the king, not by Parliament alone, but by private financiers who loaned money to the state in exchange for control over public debt. From that moment on, England's government, whether monarchy or parliament, depended on centralized financial institutions to survive. The political system changed, the financial structure locked in, and once that structure existed, no revolution could remove it without collapsing the state itself. Now look at the Russian Revolution, arguably the most radical revolution of all. The Bolsheviks didn't just overthrow the Tsar, they promised to eliminate private capital entirely. Banks were nationalized, assets were seized, private ownership was abolished. And yet, even the Soviet system could not escape the reality of finance. They replaced private bankers with state planners, but the core mechanisms remained: credit allocation, debt obligations, resource centralization, and most importantly, control over money creation. Power didn't disappear, it was reorganized. The revolution changed who controlled finance, not what finance controlled. And that's the key pattern. Revolutions attack symbols, they attack leaders, they attack ideologies, but they almost never attack the underlying financial architecture, because that architecture is what keeps society running. Food distribution, military supply, infrastructure, trade. The moment a revolutionary government tries to eliminate finance entirely, the system collapses faster than the old regime ever did. So instead, they compromise, they centralize, they consolidate, they promise reform, while quietly preserving the mechanisms that allow power to flow. This is why banking power survives. It doesn't depend on kings, it doesn't depend on flags, it doesn't depend on ideology, it depends on necessity. Every government, revolutionary or not, needs money to exist, and whoever controls the creation, flow, and pricing of money eventually controls the state. In the next part, we're going to go even deeper. We'll look at why revolutions almost always strengthen financial power instead of destroying it, and how banking institutions learn to position themselves not as rulers, but as something far more untouchable. Once you see the pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. Revolutions don't destroy financial power, they refine it. Over time, banking institutions learned a crucial lesson. To survive revolutions, they must never look like rulers. They must look like necessities. The shift didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, through trial, collapse, and adaptation. By the 19th century, banking power had evolved beyond families and private lenders into something far more resilient. Institutions that could outlive governments, institutions that could operate under monarchies, republics, empires, and revolutions alike. This is where the modern blueprint begins. Take the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. Europe was exhausted, empires were broke. Borders had shifted, and monarchies were weaker than ever. Yet, instead of chaos, something remarkable happened. Financial coordination increased, international lending expanded, government bonds became standardized, debt became portable, tradable, and normalized. Banking power stopped being local. It became systemic. And once finance becomes systemic, revolutions lose their teeth. Because revolutions can overthrow governments, but they cannot easily overthrow systems they depend on to function. This is why financial institutions stopped attaching themselves to specific rulers. Instead, they positioned themselves as neutral. A bank does not rule. A bank stabilizes. A bank does not command armies. A bank supports markets. A bank does not govern. A bank facilitates growth. Language matters. By removing themselves from politics, banking institutions made themselves indispensable to all politics. Look at the 20th century. World wars destroyed empires. Colonial systems collapsed. Entire nations were wiped off the map. And yet, financial institutions didn't vanish. They multiplied. After World War I, debt restructured Europe. After World War II, debt rebuilt it. The Marshall Plan wasn't just aid. It was a financial framework that locked nations into long-term monetary dependence. Once again, political power shifted. Financial power remained. Even revolutions that explicitly targeted capitalism struggled to escape this reality. Every attempt to build a new system still required currency credit accounting, trade settlement, resource allocation. You can rename the system, you can nationalize it, but you cannot remove it. And the moment you accept that reality, the leverage returns. This is why the most powerful banking institutions stopped resisting revolutions. They started preparing for them by diversifying geographically, by spreading influence across industries, by embedding themselves into legal frameworks rather than political offices. So when regimes fell, they didn't fall with them, they simply adapted. This is also why revolutions often end with disappointment. The faces change, the rhetoric changes, but the underlying power structures feel familiar because financial systems don't announce themselves, they don't need crowds, they don't need loyalty, they need compliance. And compliance doesn't come from force, it comes from dependency. When governments rely on borrowing to function, when currencies rely on credibility to hold value, when economies rely on confidence to avoid collapse, whoever manages those variables doesn't need to rule openly, they already won. This is not a conspiracy, it's an architectural reality. Financial power survives revolutions because it learned to become invisible. And invisible systems are the hardest to overthrow. Once you understand this, history stops looking chaotic. It starts looking engineered. Not by one group, not by one family, but by incentives that reward whoever controls the flow of money, regardless of who sits in power. And this brings us to the uncomfortable truth. Revolutions don't end financial dominance. They often concentrate it, because in times of chaos, those who manage stability gain leverage, and leverage over time becomes control. If this perspective just reshaped how you see history, power, and money, then you're already ahead of most people. This channel exists to connect these patterns, calmly, clearly, and without hysteria. If you want to keep understanding how financial systems actually work beneath politics, wars, and ideologies, make sure you're subscribed, not because of notifications, but because the next chapters go even deeper, and history only makes sense once you see the full structure.